The recovery from this, it's going to be measured in decades. What is going on now is undermining the fabric of a way of checking power that has worked for decades to ensure that power abuse has limits. Trump was asked, will you uphold the Constitution? He said, I don't know. This is not a president who feels that he needs to be bound by the rule of law.
In a recently released review of the first 100 days of the Trump presidency, the human rights organization Amnesty International USA outlines how the Trump administration is pursuing an agenda that seems bent on eroding human rights protections, fostering fear, and undermining the rule of law. I'm Adrian Harewood, and this is In Bed with the Elephant. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. That's from Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted on December 10, 1948. The principal author of the landmark document was a Canadian, the New Brunswick-born McGill University law professor John Peters Humphrey. Around the world, institutions and individuals dedicated to the defense and protection of human rights are facing increasing attacks. Human rights are under extreme duress in the United States. Someone who is well-versed in the current state of human rights in the U.S. is the Irish-born, Harvard-trained lawyer Paul O'Brien. He's the executive director of Amnesty International USA, one of the world's leading human rights organizations. I recently sat down with Paul O'Brien when he visited Canada in early May 2025. We spoke at the headquarters of Amnesty International Canada in downtown Ottawa. Here's our conversation. Paul, welcome to Ottawa.
It's great to be here. It's been really good to feel how Canadians are feeling right now, to have conversations about human rights on Red Dress Day, a beautiful moment. Although it was a very poignant and sad moment, remembering that more than 20 years ago, the Stolen Sisters initiative by Indigenous women, which Amnesty supported with a report on the Stolen Sisters, began. And each year they come together outside Parliament wearing red dresses and remembering the fact that many sisters have been taken and not recovered. And it was a really grounding moment to be here. And then I've had really interesting meetings with policymakers. And they're all asking the same question, which is, how do we cope with our southern neighbors?
Well, how do you cope with being in this moment? It has been more than 100 days since Donald Trump assumed the presidency of the United States. And one would assume that it's been a busy time for someone like yourself, given all of the things that have occurred in the last 2-3 months. Give us a sense as to the state of human rights in the United States today.
Oh, it is, it's chaotic, it's cruel, and at some level it's catastrophic. But I do want to say, as a human rights worker in the United States in this moment with Amnesty, I feel we were built for this moment. So, as an organization that was built to defend human rights and the frontline defenders who take remarkably courageous stance to do so, it is a very intense time, and our agenda is very clear and very full. We're set up for this in a way. We don't take any US government funding. We don't do anything that would give us another way of having an impact other than human rights advocacy. What I've seen, and wisely for some organizations who, for example, might do direct service delivery on the one hand and some advocacy on the other hand, some of them are choosing to quieten down their advocacy to see how this administration is going to treat advocates. But when you're a human rights organization that just does advocacy to hold particularly governments accountable, then our mission is very clear right now. So from day one, the president has essentially delivered on what he campaigned on. There were 312 policy reforms in what's known as Project 2025. It was a radical anti-rights agenda put together supposedly by, think tanks and consultants, the Heritage Foundation and others, that would provide essentially a template for the anti-rights parts of the Trump administration, which is the main part, because they were not hired for their talents, but for their loyalty to a particular agenda. Of those 312 policy reforms, in the first 100 days, they have advanced to completion, about 100 of them, 99, I believe, at last count. And they have another 60 that are substantially complete. So in 100 days, they have basically halfway completed what was the entire agenda meant for the 4 years. It has been a remarkable assault. Steve Bannon said back in 2019 that the secret to starting an administration that was going to attack the institutions and rules was to do so with muzzle velocity and to overwhelm the opposition with so much in the way of attacks that while we were focused on trying to prevent one bad thing from happening, many others would become inevitable. And that's essentially been the experience of it. So on just about every front we work on, we have seen the administration attack refugees and migrants, attack vulnerable and already targeted communities like the LGBTQI community, and particularly the trans community. They are literally trying to remove from existence protesters, and many, many attacks on racial justice, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion, which they have somehow managed to frame as something other than fighting its opposite, which is uniformity, unfairness, and exclusion. That's what DEI was fighting against, and yet they have framed it as an ideological agenda. And unfortunately, for far too many Americans, there's been acquiescence on that front. And so we now need to do the work of getting people to understand what's actually at stake.
What in attacking human rights institutions or the Human Rights Project are they trying to accomplish?
Well, my view is that this is a form of authoritarian practices which is not new. Trump is an accelerant, not a creator. And you can see much of what is happening in the United States being prototyped in other contexts. And generally, the goal of authoritarian practices is to accumulate unaccountable power as quickly as possible. So the patterns of it is, one, centralize authority underneath you and have as few checks and balances as possible. It's no coincidence that the Trump administration has passed more than 136 executive orders, but only sought to pass 5 bills. It isn't interested in congressional authorization for its agenda thus far, even though it has a sympathetic House and Senate that would potentially, as the old saying goes, pour concrete on reforms that would give them much greater lasting power. It's not interested in that.
Well, I was going to say, this might not be sustainable. It hasn't been legislated, which suggests that the next administration could change direction.
Yeah, it could, although it is not the role of authoritarians, if you look historically, to say, well, let's just make temporary fixes and leave those other branches with the same powers and authorities that they had, so that if any of those branches gains adversarial power, they can stop us in our tracks. The historic pattern has been to diminish the powers of the other institutions. And I have no confidence that the Trump administration will actually yield to electoral outcomes. Trump was asked, will you uphold the Constitution? He said, I don't know. He was asked, will you uphold due process for everybody who has been detained or arrested? He said, I don't know. This is not a president who feels that he needs to be bound by the rule of law. And so the checks on his authority, the traditional checks, we can't assume them. We need to support the role of Congress to play its role and insist that it does, but also the courts and insist that they can. So that's the first hint that we are dealing with a different kind of anti-rights actor here than just a conservative or even a radically conservative anti-rights president. You've got somebody who is more interested in the currency of power. Another criteria is the fact that he has not hired around him people for their talent, their expertise, and their ability to correct his behaviors. Meaning that if he gets it wrong, he has nobody in his inner channel to listen to who's going to say, well, actually, that might not be in the interests of the United States. And that's why it's so much more important that Prime Minister Carney says, this is where we disagree with you. And this is what we think will be the consequences of your actions, not just for the United States and Canada, but for our world. He needs to hear corrective voices. And right now, that may be foreign heads of state who are less beholden to him and weren't hired by him.
What do you think will be the consequence of this assault, this considered assault?
Well, if it's not checked, it will continue the cruelty and the chaos that is literally destroying lives, but not just that, the rules and institutions through which lives and livelihoods are protected in the long run. The recovery from this, it's going to be measured in decades. What is going on now is undermining the fabric of a way of checking power that has worked, not well enough, but has worked for decades to ensure that power abuse has limits. The answer to this current moment of chaos and cruelty is not to replace it with another benevolent dictator who happens to campaign on a pro-rights agenda, but to put back in place the checks on power that stop this from happening.
I'm curious as to how you think civil society is responding in the wake of these assaults, because what's been astonishing as an observer of what's been going on in the United States is, in some ways, the lack of response by many elements of civil society, the lack of response by people with power. I think of, for example, senators who recognize or who have stated that they recognize that there is a problem with the way in which the administration is conducting its business, yet they seem terrified to speak out. I think of someone like Lisa Murkowski, the senator from Alaska, who basically said she was too scared to speak because she was afraid of the ramifications of speaking.
Honestly, I'd just say that's an honest politician. You don't get very far in the advocacy game assuming that you're going to get politicians to be brave. If you put bravery versus political self-interest in front of any politician, and particularly electoral self-interest, you'll usually end up on the wrong side of the equation if you are counting on bravery. You can get them to be brave when it looks good for the electorate, but that's a very different thing. So I'm not counting on political leadership in this moment, and I would distinguish political leadership in the Senate and the House from civil society. I do think that outside of government, you are seeing an awakening. We're seeing it at Amnesty in terms of the support that we're getting, but we're seeing it amongst human rights organizations across the board.
So give us some examples. How is it manifesting itself?
Well, for example, we're seeing 4,000 new supporters a week join our organization. I was on a call about 10 days ago that the ACLU convened, and within 5 minutes, we hit the 5,000 Zoom limit for the number of people that could be on the call, and they couldn't take any more, so they have to organize another. This was a call about attacks on civil society and how we can collaborate together. I saw a remarkable statement by the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights and Human Rights, which articulated a joint pact that we would stand together against attacks, in a huge number of signatories in a matter of days signing onto that. Groups from all different parts of the human rights and civil rights spectrum coming together. I believe there is an awakening. I think some people hope there will be a singular leader who will be the counter voice to the anti-rights cabal. I don't think that's how it's going to work. And I don't think it's going to be an overnight sensation in the sense of the standing up of marches and protests, as happened with the Arab Spring and happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall across Europe. But I do think it will be a growing sense of civic concern and awakening. I think people are beginning to realize that the form of government the United States offers is dependent on its citizens and the people in the country deciding they have to fight to keep it.
Mm-hmm. And yet there's a counter argument. Those people who are supportive of Donald Trump and those people who might be critics of you, Paul O'Brien, and Amnesty International, they're going to say something like this. They're going to say that Donald Trump was elected. He was elected by the majority of the people in the United States. Therefore, it is right that he take the power that he's been given and use it to prosecute his agenda. And that part of his agenda or part of his argument has been that there are too many unelected people, too many organizations that have amassed a huge amount of power, like Amnesty International, that are not truly representative of the people. And that he is basically trying to take back power that has been sucked out of administrations over the last 20, 30 years. How would you respond to that?
I think it's worth listening to for a few of its points, but I would also part ways on a couple of its points. I think it is absolutely naive to fail to recognize that a vast number of the voting American public do not feel connected to politics the way it was being offered to them before Donald Trump. I think he made an offer, and despite what he was saying, that to the ears of somebody who works on human rights sounds discriminatory and cruel and othering, for many people it sounded authentic, or it sounded less like a typical politician. And it seemed to offer a pathway forward that they said to themselves felt better than what had been previously offered. And I think if we don't recognize the political resonance of some of what he has said, I think we're not learning an important lesson. There is in any culture that doesn't learn to self-correct, that the possibility of removing yourself from being able to listen to what people really are asking for. I think some questions should be asked of the institutions that just assumed we could continue to offer a form of politics that people didn't fully understand, it didn't fully resonate for them, and it wasn't changing their lives in material ways. I think there were massive unanswered questions from a human rights perspective. We didn't talk or think enough about economic and social rights. We didn't talk enough about how different identity groups were having a completely different economic experience of being an American, or different geographies in the United States. It became far too coastal and not focused enough in the center of the country. And I think important lessons need to be learned there. However, there's a very big difference between accepting that Donald Trump, the campaigner, made an offer that won votes which needs to be respected as the result of an election, and tolerating that he has since then explicitly sought to pass laws that are either in direct violations of human rights, or he has himself expressed disinterest in upholding fundamental rights that treat all people equally.
And yet his supporters will say, we feel as if our rights have been violated. We are law-abiding Americans. We play by the rules. And there are all of these interlopers who have come into our country and they are taking up space that they don't deserve. Why are we spending so much time defending the rights of these people who aren't citizens of this country?
And there's...
What's the argument? How do you counter that?
I mean, first, I think you hear it. I think you hear the fact that there is a whole constituency that has felt very alienated and therefore was potentially more susceptible to a populist authoritarian voice that said, just don't worry, you've been marginalized, stay home, don't worry about anything, I'll fix it for you because I hate those guys as much as you do, and I will disrupt the establishment that has left you feeling that your place in the line is not moving. I mean, there's been a lot of interesting studies on this. A lot of people in the United States have felt that they played by the rules, they stood in line, and they just couldn't make progress. And so then you had a candidate who came along and said, I'm going to fix that for you, and you don't have to do much. And that might have been appealing. But there is a real difference between an argument that says, you've been treated unfairly, and I'm going to make sure you're treated more fairly, which is frankly a classic political argument that any candidate will make, and a political argument that racializes it, breaks it down into identities, seeks to other and dehumanize those. It's not just going after political elites and institutional elites and saying there's a whole cabal of institutions that don't have your interests at heart. It's actually going after other identities, your fellow citizens, your fellow travelers, and saying they wish you nothing but ill. They're going to take your jobs, they're going to steal your lives, and they're murderers and other forms of othering. That, from a human rights perspective, we have to be able to pull those two issues apart and say there may have been unfairness, but it wasn't the result of that kind of reality. You are a better person than thinking that the only way your life can improve is by dehumanizing your fellow citizens or your fellow travelers in the country, those who seek sanctuary and asylum in this country. I don't think it is a deeply complex argument to say to somebody who's feeling economically left behind in the United States that the migrant worker that they've been working alongside is actually not the root cause of their hardship, or the trans student in their school who's asked for some understanding of their non-binary gender is the source of their hardship. It is the demonization of these individuals by a political elite that is preying on frustrations that is exacerbating this. And that can be tackled by a human rights organization that centers the values of all of us treating each other with dignity.
Mm-hmm. It seems as if this trend has some currency in Ireland, of all places right now. We see Conor McGregor, who seems to be galvanizing people behind this notion that migrants are the problem.
Ireland is a place I know something about, having been born there. I'm now a US citizen. And for sure, that's true. And it's true across, even in Scandinavian countries that have been sanctuaries of human rights and equal treatment, across the Northern European countries, across many contexts in the Americas.
So what's going on? Why is this, if one were to call it a contagion, what accounts for the the virulence of this contagion?
I don't think it's simple. I do think there are common causes across different geographies and different cultures. Some things that come to mind: a loss of confidence that the system is working for folks, and therefore the desire to find a scapegoat. That is one reality. And a sense, particularly with structural and deep inequalities of power, of economy, of a feeling of political voice and relevance, when people feel they are stuck or losing relative power compared to others, whether it's their wage packet or their vote, they look for scapegoats. And that's one. Secondly, I do believe that the way we consume information now, we have much greater capacity to confirm our biases and to live in a world where we're doing nothing but confirming our biases, meaning we consume polarizing media on all sides of the line, and we are increasingly struggling to find common spaces in which to just genuinely have dialogue. I think COVID was a big thing. I think the fact that it just kept us apart from each other. I often believe these kinds of conflicts can only get ultimately addressed by some recognition that we need to come together, show some humility, kindness, grace, and maybe start a few sentences with words like, sure, I might have been a little blank. And to which a person might respond, yeah, well, I might also, and sure, all right, then let's try and get along a bit better. And those humanizing moments need contact. They need us in communion with each other, in surprising communion with each other, meaning spaces where we're meeting with people who we don't necessarily agree with. I think we're doing that less and less. And I think it's happening geographically, it's happening in lots of structural ways, and it's certainly happening in our online worlds too. And if you're opportunistic about it and you're smart about it and you have resources behind you, particularly if you have access to big tech and the amplifiers and the algorithms, you can capitalize on these conditions and make political ground with a very othering and very separating and us versus them grievance-oriented message. And I think that's the bread and butter for populists.
So in this moment, what can an organization like Amnesty International do?
We can do a lot, and we have to do a lot on a lot of fronts. So just on that, we can stick to the fundamental of humanizing and standing for the humanity of every single person. All the rights, everywhere, all the time. They have these rights. They're not granted from anywhere, but they are enforced and respected through laws, both national and international. And we can just center that at all possibilities, because there is a profound, not just truth in it and common sense in it, but something that is very affirming for a lot of folks. I don't think many people actually disagree with that once you push them hard enough. That's the first thing. Secondly, we have to recognize that some of the fights that the anti-rights folks are picking now on individuals are being picked in order to create apathy and permissive space to deny more rights. There's a reason they went after Mahmoud Khalil on the Columbia campus, because he peacefully protested about rights in Gaza. By doing that, by deporting him, by taking away his green card, think of all the things you accomplished. One, you said anybody who defends Palestinian rights, or more accurately, holds Israel accountable for its human rights conduct, is anti-Semitic, potentially a dangerous threat to the country, and therefore be removed. So that sends a chilling effect. Second, it tells every single green card holder that if you open your mouth, you're potentially going to get uninvited from the United States. Third, it sends a message to every college campus that if you protest over something that challenges the administration, and we all know that college campuses and young people is where often the bravest forms of protest first start, it sends a message, we're looking out at you and we're coming for you if you do. So in one case, all those negative signals are sent and sends this chilling effect. And of course, if you can deport a green card holder for that, you can deport a green card holder for something else. If you invoke the Insurrection Act, which is the act from 1807 that would allow President Trump to unilaterally deploy US soldiers against an invasion of foreigners on US soil, he has instructed Secretary Hegseth of the Defense Department to see if it should be invoked to stop an invasion of foreigners. If he can do that now, deploy soldiers on US soil, which, let's be clear, Americans don't like soldiers wandering their streets. That's what the local police is for. But if you can do it to stop a false invasion, then you can do it to stop a racial justice march or a union strike or a protest on a college campus. The space is being created now through the specific acts that are being taken. It's the same with Kilmar Garcia Abrego. If you can disappear an individual who you've admitted was a mistake and still disappear them and put them in an El Salvadorian prison with no possibility of release, and when asked, would you do that to an American citizen? President Trump says, it depends if they're bad. Not no, but it depends on if they've done a bad thing. Who determines what really bad is? So the permissive space of doing that once creates permissive space to do other things. What's going on now is the targeting of individuals and institutions that is not just important in itself, but is sending a message to others. Watch what you do. And if people don't recognize these cases and their importance and what it will mean if we don't stand up now and say, if you do this, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you in terms of public support. It's going to cost you in terms of the political space you need to do other things. If people don't stand up now, they will take more space.
And yet some people are going to say, Paul O'Brien, you are in a privileged position. You work for Amnesty International. This is an organization that is dedicated to human rights. You have structures that will support you. Yeah. There are a lot of folks who don't have that kind of support. There are a lot of folks who feel very vulnerable. And they're going to say, what can you do for me? How can you protect me? Why should I stand up if the consequence is that I will lose my job?
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair question on their part and on your part. We are an institution that is set up for this moment. It is our job to do this. But I will say, just to be fair, we have a lot of volunteers, 250,000 in the United States, who show up for Amnesty in lots of different ways. We have a lot of people taking online actions and putting their names and their addresses down for online actions. They're volunteers. They're working in other jobs. That data can be found. They're showing up and saying, not on our watch. And they're sometimes taking huge risks to do this. A lot of the folks that we work with are in directly impacted communities whose rights have been directly attacked, named and attacked. They are from migrant communities. They're from the LGBTQI community in ways that have been attacked. There are communities of color that have been attacked. And they're showing up. But we are deeply aware that often individuals show up on human rights issues where the stakes are incredibly high and they don't have support structures. It is the responsibility of human rights organizations not just to ask for solidarity, but to be aware when they do so of the risks that folks are taking and to do our very best, either not to ask irresponsibly for engagement, or if folks take courageous acts, to have an answer to the question, so what happens next? And to be honest, we don't have capacities to do everything for everyone who decides to step forward in this moment. We have to be selective ourselves on which cases we take on and which ones we can make a deep difference on. But you're entirely right that the risks of what's going on now are being experienced vastly differently by lots of folks.
Why do you do this work?
This is the moment.
But why do you, Paul O'Brien? Like, why are you in this position at Amnesty International? What drives you? Why did you decide that this is your space? This is the fight that you want to engage in this career of yours?
All right. Well, I'll give you an answer I don't often say in public, but you asked an honest question, I'll give you an honest answer. I'm proudly born Irish, but I grew up in a time of Irish historical, cultural life where the Catholic Church had a significant amount of unaccountable power. It did some good, for sure, but there was a lot of times growing up when I looked at the way power was negotiated in Ireland, and particularly by the church and the relationship between the church and the government. I didn't like it. And I didn't like the way that things would get resolved behind closed doors with the sure, we'll work this out and we'll come back to you. And for many of us who were young growing up in the 70s and 80s, we looked at the United States and it was this beacon of something very different, which is that nobody in that context is above the law. We looked at the United States as a country that was profoundly suspicious of unaccountable power. It certainly had its flaws, but there was a feeling that American culture was about suspicion of vesting too much power in individuals. So you ask me what drives me. I don't like power abuse. I don't like power abusers. I don't like people who think they're above the law. I don't like people who think the world would be better if everybody just sat back and they did things for them. I believe we're healthier when we step forward and we hold each other accountable. That's why I came to become an American and be part. And I was told by the judge 15 years ago, don't think of myself as a second-rate American. From the day I become a citizen, I have all the responsibilities and all the rights of every other American, and you need to act like it. And I've tried to. And so I'm very proudly American. But it's under threat, this thing, and I feel very motivated to fight power abuse.
So what does the United States of America that you want to live in look like?
It is a place where no one's above the law. It's a place that has much more ability to correct itself faster. That's what I always thought was remarkable about the United States. Making mistakes all the time, of all sorts, but the ability to correct itself, partly through its institutions, its media, its people, its culture, and it learned fast. And if it was going down a bad direction, it could actually fix it. I'm scared now that it's losing that ability for all sorts of reasons. So I'm inspired to be part of fighting for that version of the United States, which is deeply flawed. I'm not naive about the harms that the United States has visited on the world and continues to do so. But it is a country that is capable of seeing these things and addressing them and fighting them. And I want to be part of that.
Paul O'Brien, thanks so much.
Thanks for talking to me. It was good to meet you, Adrian.
You've been listening to In Bed with the Elephant on Ricochet Media. Producer and sound engineer, Dave Sarrazin. Executive producers, Ethan Cox and Andrea Houston. Music by Parker Harewood. Graphics, Connor Killoran. I'm Adrian Harewood. I'll talk to you next time.